All right, we're going to see how this goes. I'm going to do a should you read today, as you saw from the thumbnail, but there is a thunderstorm happening because it's Ohio and it's spring and weather is happening. And I had a really bad headache last night, so this all kind of tracks. But it also feels like ideal ambiance for reviewing a horror trilogy, which is what we're doing today. So we're going to go with it, see if it works, but sorry in advance for the distractions by me being distracted by thunder and also whatever the microphone picks up. But we're going to talk about the Indian Lake trilogy, which starts with My Heart is a Chainsaw, goes into Don't Fear the Reaper, and then ends with The Angel of Indian Lake. I personally love that it's this color palette. It's a basic color palette, but ever since high school, one of my favorites. And if you're new to my Should You Reads, they're spoiler-free. The whole purpose is to help you decide, is this worth your time, effort, energy, money, that sort of thing. Series are a big commitment. I love series. I read a lot of series. There are so many behind me on my shelves. But I totally understand that, not every series is for everyone, and you really got to pick and choose where to spend your time and energy. And this one's unique because I'm pretty sure this is the first horror trilogy I've read, and the first horror series I've reviewed. I don't even think I've watched that many series of horror movies, which definitely exist. That's a part of the genre of horror, is having, Exorcist 1, 2, Scream 1, 2, 3, 4. Like, that's a normal thing, but it's not something I usually partake in. Horror is typically a standalone experience for me, and one that I really like. But just like all my should you reads, we'll start at the top with my experience, what baggage I brought to it, why that could make me like it more or less. I mean, spoiler alert, I really like this trilogy. I really want people to read this trilogy who haven't already, especially those who maybe feel like I'm not a horror reader. Because, I don't know, you might find yourself being surprised. Granted, I didn't know I was a horror reader till a few years ago. And because I'm scaredy cat. Like, almost could not get through the first Scream movie. Scaredy cat, okay? That's just who I am. But I picked this up last fall because a bunch of my friends really like Stephen Graham Jones. And I was like, okay, I'm going to try My Heart is a Chainsaw. Also because I had read Mongrels, which is a standalone, more literary, speculative work by this author. And I realized, I think Ryan's really going to like this. Ryan's my husband. I do like reading books that he'll read eventually. He reads a lot slower than me, but if I have the physical book, he will read it. He doesn't do ebooks. So I bought the first book. So we have a physical book. I think this is an author he'll like because he likes horror a bit more than me. And I'm like, cool. I'll read it, and I really want Ryan to read this. Like, I think he's really going to like it. Also, the rain has come, so if you hear the rain, yeah, the ambiance is really just coming. I don't have to pay any money for these sound effects today if they're coming through. So I picked it up for that reason, and instantly was obsessed. I did it like a little bit physical reading and immersion reading using the audiobook for the first book. And I recommend the audiobook for the first book. I didn't listen to the audiobook for the second book, and I did listen to the audiobook for the third book, and it was passable. It was fine, but it wasn't like my favorite thing. And the big thing I can tell you about this is that I am a big endings person, and I think this trilogy sticks the landing. It is horror and it's a slasher horror, and slasher means just like people are dying. They're always dying, and it's the third book, so like I'm not going to spoil who dies, who makes it, anything like that. But I can say that I felt completely cathartic by the end of the experience. And that's not to say that I was happy with everything that happened in the third book, but it was like, it made sense. Everything made sense. I felt like I got to spend a good amount of quality time in this community with these characters. And, slashers are such a fascinating genre. They're so campy. They are a tried and true part of pulpy horror. But they really are also saying a lot, and this trilogy is like, that's part of its agenda, and it'd be like, yes, slashers are campy and corny, maybe even a little predictable, but we're going to subvert some of those things. And also, just appreciate what slashers are also bringing to the table, some of the agendas and themes that they are bringing forth that you're not even paying attention to, but are definitely there under the surface. And like, that is the brilliance of this trilogy. So, again, the project of it, it's a slasher, keeps happening in this town in, I believe, Idaho. I feel like it's Idaho. I don't know why I can't remember this. It's at Indian Lake. I believe it's a fictitious town that's by this lake. And we follow Jade in this community throughout time. We start in 2015, and I believe we end in 2023. And each book, there's a time jump between them. So we're meeting the characters and the community at different points in time. And what I think is really fascinating is the first book, like you would believe in your neighborhood, no one believes a slasher is going to happen. That's not a thing that happens, right? But after the first slasher happens, you keep coming back to this community, and they're a little bit more prepared each time. You suddenly don't feel like there's this person crying wolf. You're more just like, why does this keep happening? And it makes the series get heavier and heavier as you go, but it's also still holds on to a lot of the spark that makes it special. So if you want a horror that is meta, that interacts with the genre, but is also still full of rich characters and world building and themes, it's a ride. It's an absolute ride. So something you'll find in all of the books before I get into maybe what each book does in a special way to me, I guess, is that there are mixed media elements in all the books. I kind of like that. I liked breaking up these kind of longish chapters. This is a series where the chapters are a bit long. And it's not like a bad thing. It's just a scenario where the author writes the chapter until the chapter's over. And it's usually like a reference to something type chapter. Like the titles of it are usually a reference to like a horror movie or something like that. And so you could have a chapter that's 30 or 40 pages, but then you have this really short mixed media section. In each book, it's a different thing that's the mixed media, and it's really fun. It also adds to the mystery because every book is this mystery. You know people are dying. You know it's a slasher, and you think you know who's doing it, but you truly never do, and the twists and turns and how you get there, and it's actually astounding because based off the acknowledgement sections, which are basically short stories in their own right, because Stephen Graham Jones does not hold back in the acknowledgement sections. He has a lot to say, and you learn a lot about the process for this trilogy in those sections, but it seems like a lot of the time, he's writing the story, and he's learning where the twists and turns are going as he writes it, and then obviously it gets polished and edited, but for someone who's not outlining things, and for the twists to feel so earned, is, I think, incredibly impressive. The rain is just really coming. It was sunny, like 5 minutes ago. Like, I'm not even kidding. And now it's just, like, ominous. I see sheets of rain, which, again, feels apt for this kind of book review situation. So we have the meta relationship with slashers, we have the mixed media, and something I want to bring up, and this is maybe the only part that's like a slight spoiler, but I don't even think it is, because horror comes in like two types of, I don't know, not genres, but you have speculative horror and you have non-speculative horror. And I'm going to say that this is not something that I would give to people who only want non-speculative horror. Like, if you want the horror to be completely grounded in reality, that's not what this trilogy is. There are real-life horrors that are being unpacked in this trilogy, but it also leans on things where you're just like, is this real? Am I just going to have a lot of go-withingness of it all? And you do. And I have found it really fun, but I just know that some people, they have very strong opinions of how they want their horror to be. Like, some people really want speculative horror and get annoyed when it becomes just like a non-speculative Scooby-Doo take a mask off a person sort of thing. And this is like definitely one where you have a mix of both, and I would just never give it to someone who's just like, I don't want any supernatural stuff in my horror. This is not a series I would give to that person. And then, of course, we have to talk about Jade. Jade is our through line. Like, this is called the Indian Lake Trilogy because that's where this takes place, around this town that is near Indian Lake. But it's really about Jade. Jade Daniels is our main character, and Jade Daniels is the glue. It is the reason why people love this trilogy. From what I can see on the internet, from my own personal experience, it's Jade. She is this woman who escapes into horror. Slashers and horrors are her escapism. They're her thing. She loves them. She could talk your ear off for hours, and that's what she does in the first book. She is precocious, she is loud, she has this huge imagination, and so when you're reading this first book, it might be a little off-putting if you don't like her voice, if you don't like her personality, but it's also really fascinating what is behind the personality. She is intentionally isolated herself because of her reality with her parents, because of how the community perceives her. She's like the only indigenous girl in town. She's that classic kind of gothic chick who's like overdoing it with the hair dye. The eyeliner is really thick. That's the type of personality we are bringing forth with Jade. But it also makes the relationships she has with the people she interacts with the community, relationships that she doesn't really even think are true and strong, but we can see it's like, no, these people care about you, Jade. And then as she starts to trust that care, it just makes those relationships even more important and strong. And I really like that. Like, sometimes I don't like an isolated character. And the weakest points of the trilogy for me are when she's isolated from people. And that happens because it's a slasher. And you can never keep the team together because it's a horror novel. And that's just how it works, right? It's very meta. It plays into things. Like, you literally will have characters being like, we really shouldn't split up right now. But the plot is like, you have no choice because you are in this kind of fantastical scenario that really shouldn't be happening because, again, slashers shouldn't happen, right? Like, that's just not a normal thing. So those are elements you're going to have throughout all the books, and you're going to see Jade grow up. You spend 8 years with Jade, and she has to recover from these traumas and the side effects it has on her, which I'll be vague about because one of the fun things about reading Don't Fear the Reaper after reading My Heart is a Chainsaw is like, My Heart is a Chainsaw ends, and you don't know what's going to happen to Jade in terms of like the real world consequences for what happens. And so you take some time in Don't Fear the Reaper to figure out, well, yeah, what happened to Jade? Like, I get that she's going to come back because we need her in this story, but like, what happened after the first book to her? Because, you know, after the like fever dream that is a slasher happens to the community, the real world has to step in and there have to be consequences for what happens. So I thought that's really handled well, how all of that real worldness always happens off page and you're always like catching up as you start the story. I think that's really fun. So the first book, I like that these are seasonal books too. That's another thing I like. The first book takes place in summer. So where are my copies? So this book, it's a summer read around 4th of July. I mean, you can read these any time of year. I read this around Halloween. Fantastic. Don't Fear the Reaper, I did read in winter, is a winter book. Takes place over like 2 days during a blizzard. Fantastic. Very like isolated. Oh no, we can't get help because it's winter. And then this is definitely a Halloween read. It literally takes place the night of Halloween. And so if you notice, this takes place like one night. This one takes place like a weekend, maybe like a couple days. And this one actually takes place over a couple weeks. So you see like each book, the timeline keeps getting shrunk and shrunk and shrunk, which like adds to the tension on top of the fact that this poor community is like, not again. Like, oh my goodness, not again. All the books are gonna have huge pop culture references. And so the first book, you have young Jade, you have naive Jade, you have Jade who's like almost excited that a slasher's about to happen in her town, and she's giving everyone roles, and the slasher's like, okay, you're gonna be the final girl, and like all of these things, and she knows the adults won't listen because adults never listen in slashers. But also, this is a small town undergoing change, and that is a big part of it. We have these rich individuals who want to invest in the land and build their mansions because it's beautiful, basically untouched land. And what are the implications of that? What are the good that they're bringing to the community, and what's the bad? And is that why the slasher was triggered? You don't know. And that is a big thing of the first book. And also the first book is like the community reckoning with this happened. What do we do? The second book, the biggest difference is it's multi-POV. You still have Jade as a POV, but you're going to have other point of views as well. And I actually really liked that. I don't think everyone did, but I thought getting insight into a lot of different people in the community was actually really cathartic, especially after the events of the first book. And also because Jade is a tiny bit more reserved. She's grown up a bit, and now her biggest dream is not to have a slasher in her town for obvious reasons. But she's always the one in the thick of things. For some reason, she can't get herself out of the center. Even though she's tired, she is like the reluctant hero trope the entire time. Something you'll see in all of the books is it's just twisty and turny, and it's when the Don't Fear the Reaper, where I say, like, technically you don't have to read these books back to back. But if you give yourself too long of a break, you're going to forget certain side characters that weren't important and why they're being brought into the plot now, because you have these communities, and it really is a community story, but Stephen Graham Jones doesn't remind you why this character is important. So you might like be told this person's name, and you're like, whose kid were you? How did that relate to the last book, and why are you important to potentially the twists and turns of this book? So in terms of connecting the dots and putting the mystery together, that could be a little tough for you if you take too long. I read these 3 books over like 6 months, 5 months, and that was good enough for me. But even then, sometimes I'm like, who are you? Why are you here? And there's no character index and things like that, and it's not spelled out for you. So in terms of like the twisty turniness, if you wait, eventually it'll just be told to you. But if you like to be a little bit more in the know and a little less confused, I'd read these books in relatively short succession. Like I said, like within a 6 month to a year period is probably pretty good. And so the third book, this one I think was the least fun for me, because at this point everything's heavy. Everyone's tired, and that fatigue comes through. It can't not come through. Why is this still happening? Why is there so much death? And also, all the books have stakes. All the books, they're slashers. People are dying. People of importance die in every book. Okay, there are legitimate consequences. Plot armor exists only for Jade in the first 2 books. And I'm not going to talk about who has plot armor in the 3rd book. But like, the only thing I can tell you is Jade is in all 3 books. And it's just the 3rd book, though, is like what few characters had some level of plot armor in addition to Jade. It's like, you don't know who's safe. And there are moments where I had to put the book down because I'm like, no, this isn't allowed. That is not allowed to happen. And it was a lot. That said, I still found the ending worth it and cathartic, and the loss, you know, it's not that the loss had purpose. It's just that we got to process it in a way that left us not feeling completely empty and void of hope. And things like that is basically how I would say it. But this is a fantastic trilogy about processing trauma, about dealing with the past, about how you live and look for a future even as literally the floor keeps dropping out from under you. And I read this book, the last book, when I felt like my personal universe had the floor dropping out of me. And there is just something powerful about watching people, even as the worst keeps hitting them in the face over and over and over again. They pick themselves back up. They keep fighting. They become the final girl, even though they don't believe they're the final girl. You know, that sort of energy. There are just amazing moments. The action in these books, the twists and the turns, like the balance between plot and its relentless pace with the ability to just be in the character's mind and still find quiet moments in a slasher genre is unmatched in this trilogy. And I think that pacing might be an issue for some people. Maybe someone wants it to just be completely plot the whole time, no introspection. But for me, as a character-driven reader, I love the combination. I truly do. And the world is just so weird, but in a perfect, like, fever dream way that I want it to be for horror. Like, I don't get it. Like, I don't understand Indian Lake. I don't think anyone does, and I think that's the point. Indian Lake has its own agenda, and you're trying to figure out how it fits in with the human agenda and why the slashers are happening. But that mystery, although you get some answers, that's not why you're there. You're there to see these people survive, persevere, keep going. And that's part of its power. So I really love it. I hope you give it a shot. In terms of, is this a horror that would work for you? It's a slasher. There's gore. I'm not a visual reader, so the gore does not bother me. If you don't like description of body parts that are not where they're supposed to be, that's probably going to be a minor problem for you. If you don't like seeing death for animals and humans, it's probably going to be a problem for you. In terms of like jump scareness, I didn't find it to ever be like, oh my God, is something, you know, like kind of when you're watching a movie, that wasn't scary for me. I mean, the scariness for me, it's not even that I read this for it to be scary. I actually loved the suspense. There's a really good amount of tension of, oh, something's about to happen. What is going to happen next? That suspense worked for me in a way that didn't terrify me. But my biggest thing is if you are really visual and you can really craft a scene, and if gore is a deal breaker for you, this is probably not the trilogy for you. Like, it's a slasher. Like, occasionally an eyeball is not going to be in someone's head. Like, it's not great in terms of like what happens to people. I'm not going to sugarcoat it. So that's just something to keep in mind. But in terms of like fear factor, there was never a point where like I couldn't fall asleep at night. There was never something where I felt terrified, but I did love that this was like a horror that unpacks societal and internal issues. And I think it does that really well. And it does that using a slasher like all slashers use. And it's just, it's great entertainment. It's great art. I love the combination of those two things. And so I highly, highly recommend it. If all these things are good for you. I mean, there's a lot of things that could be deal breakers. Like I said, the pacing, Jade is a really strong character, the genre within itself. The fact that maybe you won't get perfect answers to all your questions. For me, nothing ever felt contrived, but I guess I could see someone watching the plot go on. It's like, why is this happening? Like, that shouldn't have happened. That just happened to make this plot thing happen. Again, I never felt that, but maybe some people are more sensitive to it, and it could happen. But I think it's worth a shot. I think it's worth trying, and you might love it. You might suddenly realize, oh, I like horror. And so, if at all we have similar tastes, give it a go. If you have any questions, ask them down below. If you want to leave any other recommendations spoiler-free for other people, leave them down below. I will be deleting anything that has to do with the plot because I like these videos to be spoiler-free places, so please refrain from that. If you just want to leave an emoji to let me know you're here, leave a slasher-related emoji. I'll leave it up to you to decide which one, and otherwise, like if you liked it, subscribe if you want to, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!